Wel, bore da, prynhawn da, neu noswaith da. There was this man, his name was Handel, a bit like door handle, but spelt differently. And he was working for this man, George. George was his boss. And Handel had had enough of where he was, and he thought he'd like to go somewhere else. So he decided to go to England. He went to London. There was a queen there called Anne, Queen Anne. She liked Handel. He promised he'd be back to George, who was German, by the way, and he lived in Hanover. He was the elector of Hanover. And so Handel kept promising he'd come back, but he didn't. He stayed in London. And then one day, Queen Anne died. And guess who turned up to be the next king? George. So, we're going to listen to a piece of music by Handel. His name was George. His name was George as well. George Frederick Handel. And he came to London and did a lot of his composing, as I said, in London. Some of it for his old boss, George, who was by now George the First of England. So let's have a listen to this piece, shall we? And see what we think. So what did we think of that then, I wonder? Did we think it was a happy piece, sad piece, a jolly piece? Did pictures come into your mind, maybe? I play this piece a lot for a particular time. There's something that happens to people sometimes, and they ask me to play this piece when that happens. I wonder if you can think when you might have this sort of a piece. Might you have it at your birthday party or some other time? Can you think of a time when you might have this piece? I'll tell you what, let's play it one more time, just one more time, and then have a little listen, see not just what it's describing or even how it makes you feel, but possibly when. When might you have this piece? What sort of an occasion do you think you might have it? Well, I know you're a bit young for this, but I play this at weddings. When people get married, a lot of people like to have this music to walk into or maybe to walk out to. It's got a feeling of, it's a happy piece, isn't it? It's got a feeling of occasion, and it feels like something should be happening. You could imagine a king and queen marching down, getting married to this, couldn't you? Or even people locally here in the village getting married. I've played it for lots of people. And it's called The Arrival of the Queen of Sheeba. The Arrival of the Queen of Sheeba. And it comes from a sort of an opera, except that although Handel wrote loads and loads of operas, he also wrote things called oratorios. Funny word. Oratorios. And oratorios are a little bit like operas, but no acting. All of it is done on a stage by singers who stand there with their music. They hold their music and they read their music as they sing along, and it tells a story. And Handel wrote lots of these. One of his most famous is one called The Messiah. And there's a very famous piece from The Messiah. Have a little listen.
Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah.
There, sorry about the voice, that was me having a little sing. So he wrote lots of these, and the arrival of the Queen of Sheeba comes from one of those. And that story I was telling you about at the beginning, you know, the one where his old boss, George, suddenly turns up and he's now George the First of England. Well, there's a story that goes with this, and lots of people say it's probably not true, but let's pretend. And the story goes that George was a little bit annoyed because Handel hadn't come back to Hanover, even though he'd asked him to come back loads of times. And so, because of this, Handel promised to write a very special piece of music. And the music is called the water music. And the reason it's called the water music is because they performed it on the River Thames. They weren't swimming, they were in boats, but the orchestra was in one large boat, and then the king and all his chums, they were in another big boat. And so the idea was that in the days before you could take your stereo with you on the river, we're going back a very long way, King George had his own orchestra in a boat just next to him. Or at least that was the idea. Unfortunately, the problem was that the two boats didn't really go at the same speed, and so after a while they were so far apart that the king couldn't really hear any music at all. But that's called the water music. And here's just a little tune from the water music. It's quite a nice, soft little piece. So, there you have it. George Frederick Handel came from Hanover, and so did the next King of England. And he wrote lots of lovely music, including the pieces you've already heard. And I think it would make sense, perhaps, if we just finish by listening, it's only very short, to the arrival of the Queen of Sheeba once more. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week.